Why a Chaos sorcerer's life is doomed. I remember when I still had a name that meant something, a name beyond a mere designation in the Schola Progenium's records. They took it from me the day I arrived, a child of 7 standard years, orphaned when the planetary governor's palace fell to raiders. The smell of that place stays with me. Antiseptic and incense, the chemical tang of nutrient paste, the underlying rot of too many bodies confined in too little space. The instructors wore black robes that rustled like insect wings when they moved through the dormitories at night, checking that we slept in the prescribed positions, our hands visible above the thin gray blankets. They said we were fortunate. They said the Emperor had claimed us for his service. They said we would become something pure. The training began before dawn every day. We would march to the chapel for morning devotions, our bare feet slapping against stone floors worn smooth by generations of orphans before us. The chapel was vast and cold, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that the candles never quite penetrated. I learned to mouth the words of the catechisms while letting my mind drift elsewhere, a dangerous habit that would later prove my undoing. The Lectio Divinitatus was hammered into us through repetition and pain, a shock rod for every stumbled verse, a day without food for every question that revealed doubt. I learned quickly not to ask why the Emperor, if he was so powerful, had allowed my parents to die. I learned to perform faith even when I felt nothing. They tested us constantly. Physical tests, intellectual tests, tests of loyalty that involved informing on our dormitory mates for infractions real or imagined. I excelled at most of them, which drew the attention of the Divisio Telepathica representatives. When they came on their annual recruitment sweep, I remember the woman who examined me. Her eyes were the color of dirty ice, and when she touched her fingers to my temples, I felt something writhe inside my skull, like a parasite waking from dormancy. "This one," she said to the Schola administrators. "Mark him for secondary evaluation." I did not understand then what that meant. I thought I was being rewarded. The secondary evaluation took place in a chamber deep beneath the Schola, where the walls were covered in hexagrammic wards that hurt to look at directly. 3 sanctioned psychers sat in a triangle around me, their dead eyes covered with brass sensors, their mouths moving in silent litanies. They pushed into my mind like surgeons opening a body, and I felt myself come apart under their inspection. I saw things then, brief flashes of what they were seeing inside me. A spark, a terrible potential, something that should not exist in a loyal servant of the imperium. When they withdrew, I was left shaking on the floor, blood running from my nose and ears. One of them spoke, her voice mechanical and emotionless. "Psychic designation Gamma 7, minimal stability index. Recommend immediate transport to the black ships for soul binding or cooling." The black ship came 3 months later. I spent those months in isolation, fed through a slot in my cell door. My only human contact was the interrogators, who came twice weekly to test whether I had developed any uncontrolled manifestations. I learned to meditate, to push down the thing that writhed inside my consciousness, the presence that whispered in a voice like grinding glass. I told myself that if I could just control it, just master it completely, I would be allowed to serve. I would become a sanctioned psyker, one of the Emperor's chosen weapons. I clung to that hope, even as I felt pieces of myself begin to slip away, eroded by the constant internal struggle. The ship was worse than anything I had imagined. They loaded us in coffin-sized pods, hundreds of us, stacked in the cargo holds like ammunition. The pod was absolutely dark, the air recycled and stale. and I could hear the others through the thin walls, weeping, praying, screaming, some already lost to madness. The journey lasted weeks, perhaps months. Time became meaningless in that darkness. I felt the presence inside me grow stronger, feeding on my fear and isolation. It began to show me things, visions of the ship's interior, the suffering of my fellow prisoners, the cold calculations of the crew who regarded us as dangerous cargo. Nothing more. It showed me deeper things too, truths that the Schola had never mentioned. The nature of the warp, the things that lived there, the lie at the heart of the imperial creed. When they finally opened my pod on Terra itself, I was no longer entirely the person who had entered it. I could feel the change in myself, subtle but profound, like a bone that had been broken and healed crooked. They herded us through corridors of golden marble and black stone, past murals depicting the Emperor's glory, into the Chamber of Souls, where the soul binding would take place. I saw what happened to those ahead of me in the line. They were brought before the Golden Throne, or some representation of it, I never knew which. The psychic presence that emanated from it burned into their minds, searing away everything except absolute loyalty to the Imperium. Some survived and emerged as sanctioned psychers, marked forever by dead eyes and psychic scars. Most died, their bodies collapsing as their souls were consumed. A few went mad and had to be executed immediately. I should have been terrified. Part of me was, but another part, the part that had been growing in the darkness of the black ship, felt something else. Curiosity, hunger, defiance. When my turn came, I felt that alien presence in my mind surge forward, meeting the psychic assault from the throne with unexpected resistance. The pain was incredible, like having my skull filled with molten metal while hooks tore at the fabric of my consciousness. But instead of submitting, instead of being scoured clean, I felt something twist inside me. A refusal, a rejection. The presence whispered secrets in that moment of agony. It showed me how to redirect the psychic force, how to appear to surrender while holding something back, some core of self that remained inviolate. I must have passed the basic requirements, because I survived. They marked me as sanctioned, branded the Aquila into my flesh, and assigned me to preliminary training. But I was changed in ways their tests could not detect. The presence inside me was no longer something separate. It had integrated itself into my consciousness, becoming inseparable from what I thought of as myself. It fed me knowledge that no imperial institution taught. It showed me the mathematical structures underlying reality, the formulae that could reshape matter and thought, the names of things that dwelt in the spaces between stars. I was careful. I performed my duties as a sanctioned psyker with perfect orthodoxy, never revealing the depth of my abilities or the nature of my studies. They assigned me to an Inquisitor's retinue after 5 years of service. Inquisitor Violus was a severe man, his face a map of scars earned in the Emperor's service. His faith was absolute and terrifying in its intensity. I served him faithfully, using my sanctioned abilities to divine the presence of heretics, to interrogate the minds of suspected traitors, to shield his team from hostile psychers. I was good at it, better than I should have been, because I drew on knowledge that no sanctioned psyker was supposed to possess. In the quiet moments between missions, aboard ships traveling through the warp, or in the rare hours of privacy in our quarters, I would practice. Small things at first, manipulating probability, reading the currents of the imperium with a clarity that should have been impossible. reshaping minor aspects of reality through formulations of will and word that the imperium would have called sorcery. The first time I deliberately used what they would call chaos sorcery was on the mining world of Hadrian's Grief. We were hunting a cult that had corrupted the workers in the deep shafts, turning them toward the worship of something they called the architect of change. Viellus led us into the depths, past kilometers of tunnels carved through rock that glittered with strange crystalline formations. The cultists ambushed us in a chamber where the walls seemed to shift and flow, where reality itself felt thin and malleable. I felt something pulse in that space, a presence vast and inhuman, interested in me specifically. The cultists' leader, a woman whose skin had been transformed into geometric patterns of living crystal, pointed at me and laughed. "You are one of us already," she said. "You just haven't admitted it yet." Viellus ordered me to destroy her. I reached out with my sanctioned abilities and felt them slide off her like water from glass. She was protected by something my training had no answer for. But the presence inside me knew what to do. It showed me the words, the gestures, the precise configuration of will necessary to breach her defenses. I spoke syllables that hurt my throat, that felt wrong in my mouth, and I felt reality tear slightly as the power flowed through me. She died screaming, her body turning inside out in a spray of crystallized blood. The remaining cultists fled into the deeper tunnels. Viellus clapped me on the shoulder, praising my strength. He never suspected that I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. After that, it became easier. Each time I used the forbidden knowledge, each time I drew power from sources the imperium denied, existed or branded as heretical, the boundary between sanctioned psyker and something else grew thinner. I began to understand the true nature of what I had become. The soul binding had failed in some fundamental way, leaving me connected to powers that should have been forever beyond my reach. Or perhaps it had succeeded too well, burning away the parts of me that might have resisted what I was becoming. The presence inside me, I had begun to think of it as a teacher, a guide, revealed more secrets, the nature of the primordial truth, the pantheon that lurked in the warp's depths, the fundamental lie that sustained the imperium's existence. I served Viellus for another decade, and in that time, I investigated every form of heresy the imperium feared. I saw chaos cults in their full depravity, witnessed the transformation of humans into things that were no longer human, stood in the presence of entities that my former self would have called demons. Each encounter taught me more. I learned to hide my fascination, to perform appropriate horror and disgust. But inwardly, I was cataloging everything, building a theoretical framework that drew on both imperial doctrine and the forbidden knowledge that whispered in my dreams. I began to see patterns that connected the apparently random manifestations of chaos corruption, underlying structures that suggested intelligence, purpose, even a kind of alien aesthetics. The breaking point came on a shrine world whose name I will not record. We had been tracking a heretic for months, a former ecclesiarch who had apparently turned to the worship of forbidden gods. When we finally cornered him in the ruins of a cathedral destroyed during some ancient war, he did not try to flee or fight. He simply looked at me, looked through me in a way that stripped away all pretense. "You cannot serve two masters forever," he said. "Choose now, or the choice will be made for you." Viellus executed him personally, but his words stayed with me. That night, in my quarters aboard our transport ship, I admitted the truth to myself. I was no longer loyal to the imperium. Perhaps I had never been, not truly. The thing they had tried to burn into me during the soul binding had not taken root because there was something already there. Some fundamental incompatibility between what I was and what they demanded I become. I began to plan my escape. It would have to be perfect, leaving no trail that could be followed, no indication of where I'd gone or what I intended. I spent months laying groundwork, using my position to access information about the Imperium security protocols, about the locations of hidden enclaves and forgotten worlds where one might disappear beyond the reach of the Inquisition. I stole what I needed: books, data crystals containing forbidden knowledge, samples of materials required for certain rituals. I was patient. I had learned patience in the darkness of the Black Ship. In the years of hiding what I was, patience was the ultimate survival skill in the Imperium. The opportunity came during a mission to investigate suspected genestealer infiltration in an underhive complex. The team was separated during a firefight, and in the chaos, I simply vanished. I made it look like I'd been dragged off by cultists, left enough evidence to suggest a struggle, even planted traces of my blood in a location where it appeared I had been killed and my body disposed of. Then I fled into the deeper reaches of the underhive, into territories where imperial authority existed only in theory, where mutants and heretics and things without names congregated in the darkness, beneath the hive's legitimate levels. I found what I was looking for in the rust towns, those ramshackle settlements built in the ruins of ancient industrial zones. A cult that called themselves the Seekers of the Ninefold Path. They were crude in their understanding, their rituals more instinct than knowledge. But they recognized what I was immediately. A true practitioner, someone who had studied the forbidden arts with systematic rigor, rather than stumbling into them through desperation or madness. They offered me sanctuary, and in exchange, I taught them what I knew. I refined their rituals, corrected their errors, showed them how to draw power more efficiently from the warp without losing themselves completely to madness. It was in those rust towns that I performed my first true act of sorcery. Not a desperate improvisation during combat, but a calculated ceremonial working designed to achieve a specific purpose. We prepared for weeks, gathering materials, purifying the ritual space according to formulations I had derived from half a dozen different forbidden texts. The ritual itself took 3 days and nights, during which I pushed myself to the absolute limits of my abilities. I spoke words and languages that predated human civilization. I traced sigils in the air that burned with colors that had no names. I felt myself become a conduit for powers so vast that for moments at a time, I ceased to be entirely human, becoming instead a mathematical function, a bridge between the material realm and something beyond. When it was over, I had accomplished what I intended. I had created a ward that would hide our sanctuary from psychic detection, a barrier that would cause any psychers attempting to scan the area to simply not perceive us as significant. More than that, I had proven to myself that I could shape reality through will and knowledge, that the limitations the Imperium claimed were absolute were actually negotiable. The cost was significant. I did not sleep for weeks afterward, haunted by visions of the things I had glimpsed during the ritual, feeling parts of myself strain under the weight of what I had channeled. But I had crossed fully into the realm of sorcery, and there was no path back. The cult grew under my guidance. We became more organized, more sophisticated in our practices. I established protocols for screening potential recruits, for testing their aptitude and commitment. I created a curriculum of instruction that moved initiates systematically from basic meditation techniques to increasingly complex manipulations of probability and matter. We began to attract attention from other groups in the Underhive. Some wished to join us, others who saw us as rivals or threats. I learned to be ruthless in ways the Imperium had trained me for but never intended. Those who could not be recruited were eliminated. Those who threatened us were destroyed, often in ways that served as both warnings and demonstrations of our power. I was not entirely without conscience in those days. I tried to maintain certain standards, certain lines I would not cross. I forbade human sacrifice in our rituals, insisting that power could be drawn from other sources. I prohibited the summoning of demons, knowing that such entities were fundamentally uncontrollable and would inevitably corrupt or destroy those who trafficked with them. I told myself that I was building something different from the crude chaos cults the Imperium routinely purged. Something that combined genuine understanding of the warp's nature with disciplined practice, that might exist in some equilibrium between the dogmatic ignorance of the Imperium and the mad excess of total chaos worship. I was naive. The powers I had begun to serve had their own agendas, their own designs for me. The entity I thought of as my teacher, the presence that had whispered secrets since before the soul binding, began to demand more. It wanted sacrifices. It wanted rituals that pushed further into dangerous territories. It showed me visions of what I could become. A true sorcerer, wielding power that could reshape worlds, transcending human limitations entirely. All I had to do was surrender a little more of myself, accept a few more corruptions, perform acts that my lingering human conscience found repugnant. I resisted at first. I told myself I was still in control, still the master of my own choices. But the withdrawals were agonizing. When I refused to perform the rituals it demanded, I would be racked with psychic pain that felt like my mind was tearing itself apart. I would see things that were not there, hear voices that screamed accusations and mockeries. My abilities would fail at critical moments, leaving me vulnerable. The cult members began to notice my weakness, and in that environment, weakness was an invitation to be replaced. So I yielded, step by step, sacrifice by sacrifice, crossing the lines I had drawn until I could no longer remember where they had been. The first human sacrifice was a captured Arbite's enforcer who had stumbled on one of our subsidiary cells. I told myself it was necessary, that he would have reported our location, that his death served the survival of the group. I performed the ritual with clinical precision, using his death to fuel a working that strengthened our wards and empowered the cult's most promising initiates. I felt his life drain away through the blade. I had consecrated for the purpose, felt his soul torn from his body, and offered to powers that accepted it with something like satisfaction. When it was over, I was sick for days, but the entity in my mind was pleased. It showed me new secrets, new formulations, rewards for my obedience. After that, it became routine. We would capture enemies, gang rivals, imperial agents, sometimes just unfortunates who wandered too deep into our territory. I developed elaborate justifications for why each killing was necessary, strategic, defensible. I told myself I was protecting the cult, that these deaths served a greater purpose. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. I had become addicted to the power that flowed through me during those rituals, to the moment when I stood as a conduit between reality and the warp, when I transcended my human limitations and became something greater, if only briefly. The moral objections faded, worn away by repetition and necessity. and the seductive whisper that assured me I was special, chosen, destined for greatness beyond anything the Imperium could offer. The cult fractured after 5 years. Internal disputes over doctrine and practice, power struggles between factions loyal to different aspects of the powers we served. I tried to hold it together, but I'd made the mistake of teaching too well. My students had become adepts in their own right, some of them matching or exceeding my abilities in specific areas. They challenged my authority, questioned my decisions. Some accused me of weakness, of clinging to obsolete scruples inherited from my imperial conditioning. Others accused me of excess, of rushing too quickly toward transformations that would destroy us all. In the end, the sanctuary erupted in violent sorcerous combat that killed dozens and brought the attention of the adeptus arbites and the local inquisition. I fled again, alone, this time through the Underhive and eventually off-world, aboard a smuggler's vessel whose captain I convinced through a combination of bribery and subtle psychic manipulation. I had enough plundered wealth to secure passage to the outer systems, to worlds where imperial authority was theoretical at best. I spent years wandering, never staying anywhere long, practicing my arts in isolation, growing stronger, but also more hollow. I began to notice the physical changes. My eyes had developed a slight luminescence in darkness. My skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor. And sometimes I would catch glimpses of my reflection and not entirely recognize what looked back. The rituals were leaving marks, transforming me incrementally into something that was no longer entirely human. I should have cared more about that. The person I had been, the child in the Schola Progenium, would have been horrified. But that person was gone, buried under layers of compromise and corruption. I had become something else. A sorcerer, yes, but also a hollow thing, a vessel for powers that used me as much as I used them. The entity in my mind no longer felt like a separate presence. It was me, or I was it. The boundary eroded beyond meaningful distinction. When I performed rituals now, I barely recognized the words coming from my mouth or the gestures my hands made. I moved like a puppet animated by a will that was mine and not mine simultaneously. I found a place eventually, a dead world in a system the Imperium had abandoned millennia ago. Its star was dying slowly, its planet's lifeless rock and ice. The Inquisition had marked the system as cursed, posted warnings that kept even pirates and smugglers away. It was perfect. I established myself in the ruins of an ancient facility, perhaps a research station from the dark age of technology, its purpose long forgotten. The walls were covered in pre-imperial script I could not read, but the place resonated with latent power, with the echoes of psychic workings performed long ago. I claimed it as my sanctum and began to work in earnest. I had a vision by then, a purpose beyond mere survival. I would achieve apotheosis. I would transcend human limitations entirely, become something that existed partially in the materium and partially in the warp, free from the weaknesses of flesh and the constraints of linear causality. The rituals required to achieve this were horrifically complex, demanding years of preparation, sacrifices measured in dozens of lives, materials that could only be obtained through elaborate schemes and significant risk. I committed myself to this path with absolute focus, no longer pretending I served any purpose except my own transformation. The sacrifices required expeditions back into imperial space. I would travel to worlds on the periphery where I could capture victims, pilgrims, merchant crews, isolated settlements. I became efficient at killing, at the harvest of souls. I stopped learning names or faces. I stopped allowing myself to see the people I killed as anything except components in my work. I performed rituals that the old cults would have called excessive, that would have horrified even those who had first taught me the fundamentals of sorcery. I summoned minor demons and bound them to service, accepted their offers of power in exchange for portions of my humanity I could no longer identify or value. I spoke pacts with entities in the warp that I knew with absolute certainty were manipulating me toward ends I could not perceive. But I no longer cared about the price. Sakin Sainan, the great working, took 3 months to perform. I had transformed the entire ancient facility into a ritual space. Every surface covered in sigils drawn in blood and more exotic substances. Every chamber resonating with psychic energy. I performed the culminating ceremony in stages, each building on the last, pushing myself further beyond human limits. With each iteration, I spoke the true names of powers that dwelt in the warp's deepest reaches. I opened my mind fully to the entity that had been my teacher and guide, inviting it to reshape me as it saw fit. I felt my body begin to change, to refine itself into a form more suitable for channeling the forces I meant to master. And in the final moment, as I stood on the threshold of transformation, as my flesh began to dissolve into something both more and less than human, I felt something I had not expected: doubt. A tiny core of resistance, some fragment of the person I had been. The child who had lost his name, who had survived the Schola and the black ships and the soul binding, surfacing one last time. It whispered a question I had been avoiding for decades. Was this really what I wanted? To become a monster in service to powers that would use me and discard me? To lose the last traces of what had made me human in exchange for power that would ultimately mean nothing in the vast indifference of the universe? The doubt was enough to disrupt the ritual. The psychic energies I'd been channeling turned chaotic, backlashing through the facility with devastating force. I felt my half-transformed body racked with agony as the forces I'd been trying to master tore through me uncontrolled. The demons I had bound broke free and attacked, seeking revenge for their servitude. The entity in my mind, suddenly recognizing my moment of resistance, turned vicious, tearing at my consciousness from within. I was caught between multiple forms of annihilation: psychic, physical, spiritual. And I understood with absolute clarity that I was going to die. I should have died. By every reasonable calculation, the backlash should have destroyed me utterly. But the universe is not reasonable, and the powers I had served were not finished with me. I survived, though what survived could barely be called human. My body was transformed, but not in the way I had intended. Twisted, marked with growths that hurt to look at, my flesh bearing the scars of energies that should have burned me from existence. My mind was shattered and reforged into something that could barely maintain coherence. I existed in constant agony, physical and psychic, my consciousness fragmenting and reassembling moment by moment. I realized then what I had become. Not a triumphant sorcerer lord ascending to demonhood. Not a free agent wielding power beyond imperial comprehension. I was a cautionary tale, a failed experiment, a thing that existed in torment, kept alive by the same powers that had destroyed me because my suffering amused them or served some purpose I could not understand. The entity in my mind laughed constantly now, a sound like breaking glass and screaming birds. It showed me visions of what I might have been, the paths not taken, the choices that could have led somewhere other than this ruin. I tried to perform the rituals that had once come so easily, but my abilities were broken, unpredictable, Sometimes I could reshape reality with a thought. Other times, I could barely light a candle. The demons that had once been bound to my service now stalked the ruins of my sanctum, tormenting me for their entertainment. I was trapped in this place, this dead world, unable to repair my ship, unable to call for help, even if I had wanted to. I existed in a state of perpetual damnation, kept conscious to experience my failure, to understand the fullness of what I had done to myself. I have tried to end it. I have performed rituals designed to unmake my own existence, to sever the connection between my soul and my body. They fail, always. The powers will not release me. I am too valuable as an object lesson, perhaps, or too entertaining in my torment. I exist in a hell of my own creation, surrounded by the evidence of my hubris. The ritual chamber filled with failed workings, the walls covered in sigils that mock my pretensions, the remains of my last sacrifices slowly rotting in the dead world's thin atmosphere. Sometimes I think about the child I was in the Schola Progenium. I try to remember what he wanted, what he hoped for. I think he wanted to matter, to be significant in a universe that treated human lives as expendable resources. I think he wanted to escape the suffocating dogma of the imperium, to find some freedom in understanding truths they denied. I think he was lonely and afraid and desperate for anything that would make the universe make sense. I failed him. I took his desire for meaning and twisted it into a path that led to nothing except this broken state. Damned, trapped forever in the consequences of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but were actually steps into an abyss. This is what it means to be a Chaos sorcerer. Not power and freedom and transcendence. This endless suffering in service to entities that regard you as less than nothing, that use you and discard you and keep you alive, only to demonstrate to others what happens to those who defy the imperium's orthodoxies. I wanted to escape the emperor's tyranny and found myself in a worse slavery. I wanted to master the powers of the warp and discovered that they cannot be mastered, only endured. I wanted to become something more than human and succeeded in becoming something far less. If anyone ever finds this testimony, if these words somehow survive the death of this world and reach someone who can understand them, know this. The imperium is a tyranny built on lies and suffering. But the alternative is not liberation. It is damnation. The powers that lurk in the warp do not offer salvation or enlightenment. They offer only transformation into something that wishes it could die. I thought I was clever, that I could navigate the path between servitude to the Emperor and servitude to Chaos, maintaining my freedom and identity. I was wrong. There is no third path. There is only the choice of which master will destroy you. I spend my days in this ruin now, performing rituals that accomplish nothing except to pass the time, to maintain the illusion that I am still acting with purpose rather than simply existing in torment. The demons watch and laugh. The entity in my mind whispers reminders of everything I have lost, everything I destroyed in my pursuit of power. My body continues its slow transformation into something that cannot properly be described as alive or dead, existing in some twilight state between matter and energy, between sanity and complete dissolution. There are moments, brief and increasingly rare, when the pain subsides enough for something like clarity. In those moments, I understand the full scope of my failure and damnation. I understand that I was never the master of my fate, never truly in control. From the moment the psyker touched my temples in the Schola, perhaps from the moment I was born with the genetic curse of psychic sensitivity, my path was determined. I was always going to fall. The only question was how far and what I would destroy along the way. I destroyed everything: my name, my humanity, my soul. I destroyed the cult that trusted me, killed dozens or hundreds in my rituals, corrupted others who might have lived ordinary lives if I'd not taught them the secrets I should have died rather than reveal. I destroyed the child I was and gained nothing except this endless present of agony and regret. If there is a hell beyond this, if the Emperor or the Chaos gods or whatever entities truly govern the universe's moral architecture have prepared worse torments for my final passing, I cannot imagine what form they would take. The Imperium teaches that there is no mercy in the universe, that life is suffering in service to the Emperor's grand design, that death is the only release, and even that is uncertain. They are right, though not in the way they imagine. There is no mercy, but the Emperor is not the only master who demands absolute servitude. The powers I thought I was mastering have proven to be equally tyrannical, equally cruel, equally indifferent to individual suffering. I exchanged one prison for another, and the second prison has no walls, because I have become the prison myself, carrying my damnation in every transformed cell, every broken thought, every moment of consciousness that I cannot escape. I write these words knowing they are futile, that no one will ever read them, that they will decay with my body when the final dissolution comes. But I write them anyway, because it is all I have left. This compulsion to testify, to record, to insist that I existed, and that my existence meant something, even if that meaning is only cautionary. Do not follow this path. Do not believe the whispers that promise power and freedom. Do not think you can master forces that have existed since before humanity crawled from its birth world. Submit to the Imperium's tyranny or die resisting it. But do not imagine there is a third option that leads anywhere except here. The universe is crueler than the Imperium's most paranoid inquisitors imagine, and kinder than the Chaos cults in their mad devotion believe. It is simply indifferent. The powers of the warp are not evil in any human sense. They are alien, incomprehensible, existing in dimensions of meaning and purpose that have no translation into human consciousness. They do not hate us. They barely notice us. We are microbes in their vast ecosystems, sometimes useful, usually irrelevant, always ultimately consumed. I thought I could be different. I thought my intelligence, my study, my careful approach would allow me to use their power without being used in turn. I was wrong in ways I'm still discovering. So I remain here in my ruin on this dead world under a dying star, performing rituals that mean nothing, speaking words no one will hear, waiting for an end that may never come. This is the fate of the sorcerer, who thinks himself wise. This is the destiny of the fool, who believes he can cheat both the Emperor and the dark gods. This is damnation, not as theology describes it, but as lived experience, an eternal present of suffering with no hope of resolution, no possibility of redemption, no release except the slow erosion of the self until nothing remains except the pain. And yet some spark persists, some fragment that insists on remaining conscious, on bearing witness. Perhaps that is the final cruelty, that I cannot achieve the oblivion that would be mercy. I am condemned to know what I've become, to remember what I was, to understand exactly how I arrived in this hell of my own creation. The entity in my mind ensures I forget nothing, that every mistake is available for review, every moment of compromise and corruption preserved in perfect clarity. I am my own monument and my own warning, and I will stand here in this ruin until the star finally dies, and takes this world into darkness with it. Let this testimony stand, though no one will read it. Let it be recorded that I lived, that I chose, that I fell. Let it be known that the path of sorcery leads only here, to this eternal moment of regret and suffering. The Imperium is correct in at least this. There are things worse than servitude, worse than the soul binding, worse than death in the Emperor's service. I have become one of those things, and I would give anything, anything at all, to have that choice again, to be that child in the Schola, to choose differently. But there are no second chances. There is only this, the ruin, the pain, the endless consciousness of damnation. This is what I bought with my cleverness and my pride. This is the price of sorcery. Remember it if you can. Learn from it if anyone ever knows my story. And if you are wise, kneel before the Emperor's throne and thank him for his tyranny, because it is infinitely preferable to the freedom I found in the darkness between the stars.